There's a dark secret hidden in the most innocent story of your childhood. A detail Disney would never tell. A detail the Brothers Grimm deliberately erased from the record. And a detail only the oldest residents of a small German town whisper about on moonless nights. What you're about to discover will forever change the way you view the Seven Dwarfs. Because the truth is, there weren't 7. There were 8. For 3 years, I researched historical documents, spoke with experts on Germanic folklore, visited secret archives at German universities, and even hiked through the Black Forest itself in search of evidence. What I discovered is a conspiracy of silence lasting over 400 years, involving murder, extreme violence, and a blood pact that changed the history of world literature. But before I reveal what happened to the 8th dwarf, I need you to subscribe to the channel and like it, because this story isn't for everyone, and you'll understand why when I show you the photographs of the skeletons that were found. The images you're about to see have never been released publicly, and there are very powerful people who don't want this truth to come to light. It was a cold October morning in 1987 when German researcher Margarete Hoffmann's life changed forever. A 34-year-old mother of 2 young daughters named Anna and Greta, Margarete had dedicated the last 10 years of her academic career to unraveling the mysteries behind Germanic folktales. She was known for her obsessive meticulousness and her ability to find historical connections where others saw only fantasy. On that particular day, she was in the library at the University of Marburg, poring over a collection of medieval manuscripts that had been donated anonymously the previous year. The documents were in poor condition, many nearly illegible due to age and humidity. Margarete had spent weeks cataloging each fragment when her fingers touched a parchment hidden between the pages of a 17th century prayer book. The parchment was different from the others. It was preserved in an almost supernatural way, as if someone had deliberately taken care to ensure it would survive the centuries. The words were written in Old German, with a nervous, hurried handwriting, as if the author were afraid of discovery. At the top of the document was a sentence that made Margaret's blood run cold. The truth about the 8 companions of the forest girl. May God forgive our souls for what we witnessed. This wasn't just another folktale. It was a testimony. To understand why the huntsman was removed from the narrative, we need to travel back in time to 1604, almost 2 decades before Snow White herself arrived. The dark forest back then was an even more dangerous place than we know it today. Bandits, wild animals, and worse, men who had lost all connection to humanity. There's a reason Dunga never speaks in the version we know, and it's directly linked to the trauma he experienced when he was just 12 years old. Yes, Dunga was a child when it all happened. A child who witnessed horrors no adult should ever witness. The true story begins with Iris Schneider, a 14-year-old girl who arrived in the forest on a new moon night in 1604. Iris was not a princess like Snow White. She was the daughter of a blacksmith from a neighboring kingdom, a peasant girl who had suffered a terrible act of violence that society at the time not only permitted but encouraged. She had been raped by a local nobleman while picking flowers to sell at the market, and medieval law dictated that she must marry her attacker to preserve her honor. Iris chose to flee to certain death in the forest rather than accept a life of torture alongside the one who had raped her. Her clothes were patched with scraps of different fabrics. Her leather shoes were riddled with holes and tied with rope, and her eyes carried an ancient fear that only someone who has lost their innocence in a brutal way can bear. During her desperate escape through the dark forest, she ran for hours until exhaustion and desperation caused her to trip on an exposed root. Her head hit a rock hard, and she collapsed on the spot, just a few meters from the dwarf's house, blood streaming from her forehead. Margaret's manuscripts describe how Iris was found by the 7 working dwarves the next morning as they were leaving for another day of work in the gemstone mine. Master, the group's leader, immediately ordered her taken inside and tended to her wounds. Bashful wiped the blood from her forehead. Sneezy prepared medicinal teas, and Happy offered her his own clean clothes so she could change. But there was an 8th dwarf, a hunter, and he had a very specific role in the community. He was responsible for bringing fresh meat to the table. But over the years, his hunting methods had become increasingly sadistic, and the other dwarves began to suspect that he took pleasure not only in killing animals, but in making them suffer before death. And here begins the part that explains why this version was completely buried by the official history. Dr. Heinrich Weber, who has dedicated 30 years of his career to the study of Germanic folklore at the University of Heidelberg, explains that the original folktales were much darker and more realistic than the modern versions we know. According to his research, these stories served as concrete warnings about real dangers that people faced in everyday life, especially young women in male-dominated medieval societies. Weber discovered during his investigations that many seemingly fantastical tales were based on real events that affected entire communities. These stories were passed down from generation to generation as a primitive form of education about personal safety and identifying dangerous individuals. Forensic psychologist Dr. Elena Muller, an expert in historical trauma and predatory behavior, adds even more disturbing information. According to her studies, patterns of predatory behavior were meticulously documented in folk narratives as a way to preserve collective memory of dangerous individuals in small communities where everyone knew everyone else. It was a primitive form of criminal record and social protection. Dr. Muller explains that the systematic removal of these elements from later versions of the tales was no accident. It was a deliberate attempt to erase from collective memory the methods medieval communities used to deal with sexual predators. This created a historical gap that allowed similar behaviors to recur without people recognizing the warning signs. What makes the hunter's case particularly disturbing is that, according to Margarete Hoffmann's detailed records, he wasn't just a fictional character created to scare children. He was based on a real person named Johann Müller, who lived in that particular region of the Black Forest between 1595 and 1618, and whose crimes were so horrific that the Catholic Church itself refused to give him a Christian burial. Curiosity trigger plus callbacks plus detailed development. Remember I mentioned that Dopey never speaks? Now you'll understand the real reason behind his silence, and why Disney creators maintain this trait even without knowing its dark origins. According to the original manuscript found by Margaret, Dopey was actually the youngest of the dwarves, only 12 years old at the time of the events. He had lost his parents in a plague epidemic and was taken in by the other dwarves as a sort of collective foster son. Dopey was responsible for lighter tasks, such as preparing meals and keeping the house clean, while the others worked in the mine. The day Iris was attacked by Hunter, Dopey had come home early because he was feeling sick. He was lying in one of the beds upstairs when he heard Iris waking up screaming downstairs. The boy crept down the wooden stairs and witnessed, through a crack in the door, all the violence Hunter committed against the girl. The manuscript details that Dunga was paralyzed by terror, unable to move or scream for help. He watched Kakador touch Iris inappropriately, saw the blood when she tried to resist, witnessed her desperately running out of the house, and heard the deafening sound of the gunshot that knocked her down. But the worst was yet to come. As Hunter dragged Iris's body back into the house, Dopey continued to watch, now completely catatonic. He saw Hunter continue to abuse the girl's lifeless body, whispering horrific things while smiling in a way the manuscript describes as diabolical. The boy witnessed details so traumatic that, according to modern experts, they caused a severe form of dissociative disorder. When the other dwarves finally arrived from the mine after hearing the gunshot, they found Dopey hiding under the stairs, shaking uncontrollably and completely mute. He never spoke again for the rest of his life. The trauma was so severe that his brain simply shut down his ability to communicate verbally as a protective mechanism. Dr. Elena Muller explains that Dunga's selective mutism is consistent with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, especially in cases where children witness extreme sexual violence. She notes that preserving history through silence is a common defense mechanism in communities that have faced collective trauma. The child's brain literally erases their ability to verbalize the trauma as a form of psychological survival. In-depth investigative development. The details of what the hunter did to Iris, according to the manuscript, are too disturbing to describe fully in this video. But I can say that when the other dwarves returned from the mine after hearing the gunshot echoing through the mountains, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives and explain all their subsequent actions. The manuscript reports that Master, the leader of the dwarves, entered the house first and immediately vomited upon seeing what Hunter was still doing with Iris's body. Bashful, who had always been the most sensitive of the group, fainted instantly. Sneezy began sneezing uncontrollably from the shock, developing the nervous condition that would characterize him for the rest of his life. Happy never smiled the same way again, his laughter becoming forced and melancholic. Sleepy developed chronic insomnia and began sleeping during the day to avoid nightmares. Grumpy, in turn, channeled all his pent-up rage against Hunter. The dwarves' justice was swift, brutal, and meticulously planned. They didn't just kill the hunter, they made sure he suffered the same way he had made Iris suffer. First, they tied him to the same tree where Iris had tried to hide during her escape. Then, using the same ropes he had used to bind her hands, they completely immobilized him. The manuscript details that they didn't burn him immediately. First, Grumpy used the same knife Huntsman used to skin animals and gave him the exact same treatment. Meanwhile, the other dwarves forced Huntsman to watch as they prepared a proper funeral pyre for Iris, treating her body with all the respect and care he had denied her. Only after hours of methodical torture did they finally set Hunter on fire, watching his skin melt away as he screamed for forgiveness. The manuscript mentions that his screams could be heard for miles, and that even the forest animals fled the area that night. They then made a solemn pact. They would never speak of the eighth dwarf again. They buried both Iris and Huntsman, but in very different ways. Iris was given a proper burial with wildflowers and prayers. Huntsman was buried upside down, with wooden stakes driven through his chest, following medieval traditions to prevent evil spirits from returning from the dead. But the story doesn't end there, and this is where things get even more disturbing. Margarete Hoffmann discovered that years later, when Snow White finally arrived at the same house, the dwarfs had been completely transformed by the traumatic experience they had endured. They developed a collective obsession with protecting young women, especially those who arrived in the forest fleeing from dangerous situations. The manuscript reveals details that never appeared in the official versions of the tale. Snow White was not immediately accepted by the dwarves. In fact, when she knocked on their door, they were initially terrified, thinking it might be Iris's spirit returning. Dopey, now a young adult but still completely mute, was the first to recognize that it was a real person in danger. The dwarves had buried Iris in a grave at the back of the property, marked only by a small wooden cross Sleepy had carved by hand. Every night, without fail, Dopey would go there to place wildflowers on the makeshift grave and whisper silent prayers that only he could hear in his own mind. He had developed a spiritual connection with Iris, as if she were an older sister he had failed to protect. When Snow White arrived, the dwarfs implemented security measures that hadn't existed in Iris's time. They never left Snow White alone in the house. There were always at least 2 dwarfs present. They installed special locks on the doors and windows, created secret hiding places in case she needed to hide quickly, and set up emergency signals she could use to summon help. Interestingly, Snow White's stepmother was never able to find the dwarf's house, even with all her dark magic and magic mirrors. Margaret discovered references in other documents suggesting that the protection around the property wasn't just physical. There was something supernatural protecting the place. Some scholars who have analyzed Margaret's manuscripts believe the mystical protection was created by Iris's own tortured soul, which remained bound to that place to ensure no other girl would suffer the same horrific fate. The manuscript mentions that, during the first years after Iris's death, the dwarves often heard female footsteps at night, doors opening and closing by themselves, and a comforting presence that consoled them during nightmares. Dr. Weber mentions in his research that there are documented accounts of peasants in the region who, until the late 19th century, avoided that specific part of the forest at night. They claimed to hear desperate female screams, the smell of burning flesh when the wind blew from a certain direction, and an oppressive feeling of being watched by something evil hidden among the trees. What makes this whole narrative even more sinister is that Margarete Hoffmann discovered parish records from the region that confirm the historical existence of a man named Johann Mahler, known locally as the Hunter, who lived exactly between 1595 and 1618. Local church records indicate that he was burned to death for reasons that the priest at the time refused to officially document, noting only for crimes against divine creation. Even more disturbing, there were several formal complaints filed against Johann in the church archives, all involving inappropriate and violent behavior toward young women in the area. At least 6 different families had filed formal complaints, but Johann always escaped punishment due to his position as the official meat supplier to the local nobility. Remember the rifle hunter used to shoot Iris? In 1994, Margaret organized an unofficial archaeological expedition to the region and found physical evidence that confirmed specific details of the manuscript. She discovered fragments of a primitive firearm, of the type used in the early 17th century, buried near the site where the dwarf's house supposedly stood. The gun had been deliberately destroyed before burial. The barrel was broken into 3 pieces, the trigger removed, and the entire mechanism had been hammered beyond recognition. It was as if someone wanted to ensure that this weapon could never be used again, not even symbolically. Even more impressive, Margaret found evidence of the dwarf's own house. Stone foundations of a small, low building, exactly as described in the manuscript, with 7 small rooms and an 8th that had been deliberately demolished and filled with stone. The dwarves had literally erased any evidence of the hunter's room's existence. During the excavations, she also found personal objects. Fragments of women's clothing dating back to the 17th century, pressed flowers that had been preserved almost miraculously, and something that had kept her awake for weeks. A small rag doll that had clearly been handmade, probably by a child. Most disturbingly, according to the detailed manuscripts, Dopey developed a pathological obsession with protecting young women after witnessing Iris's trauma. The documents describe how he created an elaborate surveillance system around the estate, using non-lethal traps to detect approaching strangers and visual cues that only the other dwarves could interpret. When Snow White finally arrived decades later, Dopey was the dwarf most insistent on keeping her safe indoors, never allowing her to go out alone, even during the day. He had become a sort of silent guardian, communicating only through elaborate gestures that the other dwarfs had learned to interpret over the years. The manuscript reveals that Dunga also developed a supernatural ability to detect malicious intent in people. He could identify predators simply by observing body language and microexpressions, a skill he likely developed in response to the trauma of failing to protect Iris. Dr. Weber discovered in his research that the original version of the tale included references to this special ability of Dopey's. In earlier versions, he was described as having eyes that see beyond the soul, a trait that was completely removed when the story was adapted for children. Dr. Muller explains that the development of hypervigilance is common in children who witness extreme violence. The brain essentially rewires itself to constantly detect threats, creating ongoing anxiety but also a unique ability to identify dangers that others cannot perceive. But there's something that even Margarete Hoffmann, with all her experience and academic resources, couldn't fully explain. In 1994, exactly 7 years after her initial discovery, she returned to the Black Forest region for a more in-depth archaeological excavation. She had secured private funding from a source she never publicly revealed, and she was determined to find definitive physical evidence of the dwarf house's existence. What she encountered during this second expedition so disturbed her that she immediately abandoned all research, sealed all her documents, and never spoke publicly about it again. Her university colleagues report that she returned from the expedition completely transformed, thin, with gray hair she hadn't had before, and eyes that seemed to have seen something that shouldn't have been there. Margaret discovered not one, but 2 skeletons buried in the exact location described in the manuscript. The first clearly belonged to a young woman, comparable in age to Iris's 14 years. The skeleton showed signs of extreme violence and a skull fracture consistent with a gunshot wound. But the second skeleton was the one that truly disturbed her. It showed unmistakable signs of death by burning, confirming the details of Hunter's execution. What's disturbing is that the skeleton was buried upside down, its hands tied behind its back using ropes that had fossilized over the centuries. There was clear evidence that the body had been deliberately mutilated before burning. Systematically broken bones, cut marks on the ribs, and signs that body parts had been removed and buried separately. The dwarves didn't just kill the hunter. They ensured he could never find peace, even in death, following specific medieval rituals to prevent evil spirits from returning. But here's the detail that made Margaret abandon everything. Along with the two main skeletons, she found evidence of at least 3 other graves on the property. 3 other female skeletons, all young women, all showing similar signs of violence. Iris wasn't Hunter's first victim. She was just the last. Margarete Hoffmann died in 2003, officially of natural causes, but her family reported that she had developed severe paranoia in her final years. She constantly checked locks, avoided leaving the house after sunset, and kept all her curtains permanently closed. Her complete records were sealed by the University of Marburg and remain inaccessible to this day. Officially, the seal was made out of respect for the family and due to the sensitive nature of the material. Unofficially, there are rumors among scholars that Margaret found evidence that Kakador's lineage did not end with his death, and that other members of his family continued his crimes over the following centuries. But here's the real plot twist that will keep you up at night for weeks. In March 2019, a German family purchased a 15-hectare plot of land in the exact region of the Black Forest where Margaret had made her discoveries. They planned to build a country house to spend the summers with their 3 young children. During excavations for the foundation of the new house, the backhoe uncovered the remains of an ancient stone building, and, buried in strategic positions around it, 3 more skeletons of young women. But these were different from the others. These skeletons were much more recent, dating back to the 19th and 20th centuries. German police opened a full criminal investigation, but after just 2 weeks, the case was suddenly reclassified as a historical matter without contemporary criminal relevance and permanently closed. The land was resold to a real estate company, which immediately resold it to anonymous buyers. The family that made the original discovery reported to local police that during the 3 weeks they remained at the site before the forced sale, they witnessed unexplained phenomena. During nights of the new moon, voices could be heard whispering in the forest. Always female, always calling for help, always coming from the exact direction where the skeletons had been found. And if you think this story ends there, you're completely mistaken. Because in July 2023, just 2 years ago, a German YouTube channel specializing in local mysteries and paranormal investigations posted a 47-minute video investigating these very discoveries. The video garnered over 2 million views in 48 hours and was going viral when it suddenly disappeared from the platform. The channel, which had over 800,000 subscribers and had been operating without incident for 5 years, was completely removed from YouTube without any official explanation. The channel's creator, an investigative journalist named Klaus Weber, never posted content on any other digital platform again and, according to neighbors, moved to another city without leaving an address. The only thing we know, through screenshots some viewers took before the video was removed, is that Klaus had discovered something about the exact location of the dwarves' original home, and that, apparently, the structure still exists, hidden in a remote part of the Black Forest that doesn't appear on official maps. Even more disturbing, Klaus had found evidence that the house wasn't abandoned. Someone or something still lives there. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to continue investigating this story, because what I recently discovered about this house's current location and who might be living there will leave you wondering if some legends never truly end. And if you know someone brave enough to watch this kind of content without falling asleep, share this video with them. But I'll give you the same warning Klaus Weber gave before he disappeared. Be careful when you choose to watch this investigation. Some secrets are best kept during the day, when the shadows can't whisper back.